Fantastic. Okay, cool. We are ready to start. So welcome everyone to International Archives Day 2021. I'm Natasha Cantwell, Communications and Public Programming at Public Record Office Victoria. And this talk today is brought to you by Public Record Office Victoria and ancestry.com.au. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of all the many lands that we're meeting on today across Australia and maybe even further afield. And I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So after the talks, we're going to have a Q&A. So if you've got any questions, put it into the chat, put it into the Q&A. And after both speakers have presented, then I'll be asking them some of your questions. So let's get underway. So our first speaker is Catherine Dwyer. She is the writer and director of the critically acclaimed documentary Brazen Hussies, which is a deep dive into the history of the Aussie women's liberation movement of the 1970s. Brazen Hussies was nominated for the 2020 ACTA Award for Best Feature Documentary, and it's listed as one of the Guardian's top 10 Australian films of 2020. So I will now hand over to Catherine.
Thank you. Okay, I have a presentation, so I'll just share my screen. There we go. Can everyone see that? Okay, well, it's a great honor to be presenting a talk about how I made Brazen Hussies for International Archives Day. We certainly mined a lot of archives to make Brazen Hussies. And I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm speaking today, which is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in Melbourne. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Okay, and to start with, I'll just note that this picture of Elizabeth Reed flashing her underpants is probably actually one of the only recreated shots from the film. Nearly everything else in the film were actual archives that we found, film, photographs and records. But as there was no one there when Elizabeth Reed, no one there to take to document Elizabeth Reed flashing her underpants, I had to ask a friend to recreate that for me. So how did Brazen Hussies get made? And I'm going to go ahead and assume that people here have seen it, hopefully. If not, there is a 1-hour version on iView at the moment, and I do recommend accessing that, but we also have a 90-minute feature, which is even better. And there's a trailer too, which will give you an indication. It's about the women's liberation movement. How did it get made? It took 5 years, lots of research. I've got here some of the texts that were very instrumental in making the book, the film. And I've just put Susan McGarry's book, Dangerous Ideas, over here because I only had it as a PDF, but I didn't want it to be left out. I accumulated 4,399 archival documents, that not all of which were used in the film, but that's how many I accumulated. And that's, I suppose, because these days with mobile phones, you can take pictures of the archives as you're going through them. So you do accumulate quite a lot of material, which you then have to sift through. We drew from 823 archival clips and films, and we did over 26 interviews. One of us had a baby during the making of the film. It wasn't me, it was producer Andrea Foxworthy, and also cried many tears in making it. So here is a before picture of us in 2018, looking very fresh-faced and optimistic. And this is a picture of what I became in making the film, sort of obsessive, crazed detective who's drawing links between things. I actually love researching it, so I really enjoyed sort of taking the deep dive into the archives, but it certainly was a rabbit hole, and I think I might have broken my brain in making it, but it was certainly worth it. So my talk today, I will go through some of the archive sources I used to make the film, and then I'll talk about the ASIO file, since this is a talk for the Public Record Office in Victoria and these public records. So I'll talk about a bit about how the ASIO files helped me to make Brazen Hussies. And we, of course, used quite a bit of material from their files, both photographs and film, and memos. Then I'll talk about some lost treasures. So this is some things that we couldn't find. They include stories we would have liked to have told, but the archives have been lost. And maybe, so there's some mysteries there, and maybe some people out there might be able to help us solve them. And then finally, I'll talk about what's next for the project, and what I'd like to, some outcomes I'd like to happen as a result of making the film. So archival sources, I've just listed a lot, but not all of the archival sources that we used. I won't say they were all, because I've definitely left them out, but in terms of the footage, the ABC TV and radio archives were integral to making the film. We had an amazing collaboration with the ABC, and shout out to Kate Jarvis, who was our researcher there, who found so much treasure for us. We also you got a lot of material from the National Film and Sound Archive, and for some reason I wrote Institute there. And that was amazing. It's interesting in terms of searching the archives for records about the women's liberation movement. In a lot of cases, I would only have to say, to type in women, and for it to yield results. And I guess that sort of speaks to the idea of a group of women getting together is a political act, and you only need to use that one word to sort of find a material of women making the news, or being written about, if that makes sense. So yeah, film archives, photographs, graphic archives, the Tribune collection at the State Library of New South Wales was an incredible source, and speaks about the sort of luck I had in making the film, in that a lot of things are being digitized now. And so it's given me access to a lot of material that has otherwise been a lot harder to access. And it's, you know, it's even easier to do it from home on the internet, to be a detective from home. But the Tribune was the communist newspaper, and they no longer exist. But they donated their film negatives to the State Library of New South Wales, and they have scanned them. So there's just an amazing resource of photographic history there to be sifted through. And I've included this image of Kate Jennings here because this is the only known photograph of the famous Kate Jennings speech that's in the film. And it seems to be an orphan work. We and several other people have tried to determine who took the photo, and so far I haven't been able to source it. So if anybody does know who took the photo, that would be wonderful to find out. But it seems to be the only documentation of the speech. In the film, we managed to sort of recreate the scene by using a lot of footage from anti-Vietnam War moratoriums, and I did a reenactment of the speech, and a lot of people have thought that it was actually, a film of the actual speech happening, which is a great compliment to our editor, Rosie Jones, who managed to piece that together in a really clever way. But yeah, that's all there is. Of course, there is a record of the speech, which you can read, and it's incredible. And I also like to sort of acknowledge Alva Gecki, who's in the film. She let me access her personal women's liberation archives, and they sat in my living room for over a year in boxes, and I just raided them, and a lot of material that we ended up using for the film came from Alva's archives, personal records, which are just so invaluable. And I won't list everyone, but if anybody does want more information on the archival sources we use, please get in touch. So there were a lot of personal sources as well, women contacting us with their personal photographs documenting the women's movement, which was just amazing for bringing the movement to life, because it was a grassroots movement. It was a movement of women that happened all over Australia, and it was so great to get these photographs from women sent in to us. So particular acknowledgement to Amanda George. This is a photograph from Perth, which is my hometown. And I particularly love the woman with the placard that says "Women are angry." It really says it all. And then also Chris Reynolds, who went to great effort to track down the original photograph of the women's liberation underpants hanging on the line. That was, and to Andrea, who coordinated retrieving this photograph. Andrea is the co-producer of Brazen Hussies. Personal sources. In terms of collective memory and collective amnesia of the sort of danger that I felt, the danger of losing this history that I felt was going on, and the reason why I made the film was a very strong sense that this second wave women's movement was being forgotten by people my age and people younger. So in terms of that forgetting that's going on, just recently, Kaz Cook posted on Twitter a request to find out who this woman was in this picture with Zelda DePrano. And with, I love a good mystery, so I've been trying to help. And if anybody out there who's listening recognizes her, please get in touch, because we'd love to know what her name is. But it reminded me that when we were making the film and we were trying to clear all the images, we couldn't track down a high resolution copy of this image. We only had a very low res version of it. And Andrea went to great lengths to try and track down the original source of the image, but we couldn't find one. And then I did find, in an interview with Zelda DePrano, Katrina Sawyer, who was a filmmaker who had actually tried to make a film very similar to Brazen Hussies, and hers was called Shameless Hussies. Zelda had said, mind you, none of these newspapers have any of these photos. They threw them all out. There is absolutely none. But if you want to use them, they'll charge you and I couldn't understand what she was saying there, but you can imagine. None of these photos can be traced back to their source because they've all been thrown out. So in the end, we had sort of allocated this image to be an orphan work. Please contact us if you know differently. But in terms of the danger of this history being forgotten, it's very real. And thank goodness that Zelda kept her, went to so it would have been a newspaper image. She would have gone to the newspapers and got a copy of the photograph herself. And so it's in Zelda's archives that these photos ended up. So thank you to Zelda and other archivists for keeping the archives when the official sources or the official creators of archives don't value the historical importance of these things. And in terms of finding treasures in the archive, I just want to tell a quick story about Rosemary West. In the film, Rosemary tells a very moving story about becoming a single mother when her boyfriend died in a car crash and she was pregnant. And this image up here is the only, Rosemary told me, was the only image that she had of her and Bill in the same photo. And they are at a End White Australia policy protest. They were both involved in the student action against the White Australia policy. And it's quite heartbreaking that this is the only photo she has of them together, and they're not even standing together. And then searching through some archive footage, just looking for material for our fine cut, we I think we were just looking for more archive to fill out the fine cut of the film. And the filmmaker Alex Morgan very kindly lent us some archival footage to look through. And I was going through a film about the White Australia policy, and it's only on screen very briefly for about 2 seconds, but there was Rosemary West and her boyfriend Bill in a shot, and I just made my day. I couldn't believe it. I thought that I had found something that Rosemary wasn't even aware of, but it turns out that she had actually gone and made a film about the student action and the White Australia policy so that she could collect as much visual material of Bill that she could to show to her daughter because he had died. So another kudos to Rosemary for doing that. And moving on. I'll go to the ASIO files, since these are files of public record. They were incredibly useful to me in tracing the sort of development of the women's liberation movement, because the ASIO officers kept just incredible records of the movement as they appeared in the press. And so it was a great place to sort of go through newspaper clippings and find out what happened and find stories. These two articles here are about the very first meeting of the Sydney Women's Liberation in January 1970. In the film, we have Martha and Sarah talking about it because she was the organizer of the first meeting. And she talks about it being the hall being packed, and there was hardly room for people to move, and there must have been 100 people. Well, the press said 40 angry women meet. So we didn't use this article to illustrate the press coverage of the meeting because it contradicted what Martha had said. But I just love that title, 40 Angry Women Meet. They were probably downplaying the number of women who were at the meeting. They consistently downplayed the sort of impact that the movement was having. And it is very interesting sort of tracing the movement through newspaper articles, because it was a very biased male-dominated press who really wanted this, wanted to make a spectacle of the movement, but also wanted it to go away. So, also, sorry, this revolution is too wild for me. It's another great headline that I found in the ASIO records. And this picture is also a particular favorite of mine that we didn't use because we couldn't find, we would have had to have sourced the original photo, and it was all too difficult. But And there was a lot of stories of women going into bars, and we told a few of the film, but I particularly love this one. The women in the Sydney Women's Liberation dressed up as men and invaded the Petersham Inn. And there's Suzanne Bellamy with a drawn-on moustache, and Gail Kelly and Barbara Levy. And it just amuses me no end, this incident. It's just a brilliant tactic, along with the bum pinching that did make it into the film. In terms of ASIO watching women from the women's movement, they were serious, and they really did sort of surveil some women, you know, non-stop all the time. They were very afraid of left-wing affiliated movements, and as the women's movement sort of came out of the new left and had ties to communism, it was seen as very threatening. I have here a picture of Biff Ward with her ASIO file, and it's just mind-blowing how thick it is. And Biff's father had been in the Communist Party, so once you were sort of tainted with that brush, you were on their watch list. But Biff herself was also very active. She was a very active anti-war organizer, and would have drawn the attention of ASIO through that. But just to show you the kind of thing that ended up in her file, this is a photograph of Biff on TV. So ASIO agents would have been at home and taking photographs of the TV and filing it away. This was a great lead for me in terms of finding footage. So I was able to go to the ABC and say, Biff was on this day tonight, on this date. But unfortunately, not everything from the archive still exists. So there's a lot of stuff, great material that, you know, has been lost to history, or maybe is sitting shelved shelved away somewhere and will be discovered at a later date. But I couldn't track that down. But on the right, we have me swearing to overthrow the patriarchy on this ASIO file, which I think is an appropriate ritual that we should all adopt. I probably have gone on a bit long, and I'm starting to run out of time, but I'll skip over this. An example of the kind of records that ASIO kept on people like Biff, just to show you how banal they are. This is a memo saying her phone was tapped, so they would record her phone calls. And I love the heading, Subversive Influence, Women's Liberation Movement. Jenny, in conversation with Biff, asked if the place they were going to stay in, would they need to take their sleeping bags there? I mean, that's just how banal these memos are. But for Biff, I suppose they're a great record of her life. On the other hand, I think it's extremely creepy to be watched like this by your government, and I don't think I would have felt comfortable being watched, but perhaps you get used to it. Another very amusing memo that I found in Zelda Deprano's ASIO file. She was also in the Communist Party, so if you were in the Communist Party or had close links to it, you're pretty much guaranteed to be having your phone tapped. And so this memo said, and I won't name the person, but I have spoken to them about this incident and may do a follow-up interview. In a recent conversation, Bon Hull said that, and I'll call her Jill, that Jill, who 12 months ago was opposed to the aims of the women's liberation movement, was now one of its most fanatical supporters. Hull said that she believes this to be the main contributing factor in the separation of Jill from her husband. I remember reading that and just thinking, wow, it's so gossipy, you know, the idea of these ASIO agents writing up these gossipy memos of private lives of these women. But also it's very true that the women's movement did break up a lot of marriages. And also just noting here, the song that we used in Brazen Hussies for the sort of ASIO surveillance section of the film was Girl Watcher by the Occasions. And it fit perfectly with the idea of these women being watched by the government. I guess I won't go into Vera Figner because it's in the film, but shout out to Juliet Rowe who did the animation and had the brilliant idea to put Vera Figner riding the dynamite stick like a witch's broomstick to blow up the star. That's an actual photo of her. And in terms of just how sort of insidious and creepy the ASIO surveillance was, here is a picture of Sigrid Merle Thornton, who is a character in the film, and her daughter Sigrid Thornton, who was 12 years old, and her husband Neil. So Merle and Neil were the targets of the ASIO surveillance in this photograph, but then they list child, possibly Sigrid Thornton. So just the fact that, you know, they know who your children are and they are watching them too, I found really creepy. But at the same time, when I found this photo, I was very excited because I grew up watching Sigrid's famous TV show. And I've gone over time, so I should probably wrap it up. But finding Sigrid in the ASIO files was very exciting. And here she is on film, and she is the narrator of the TV version. So that was quite a treasure find. I do have some lost treasures that I was supposed to talk about, but I've gone way over time. I'd be happy to talk about them another time. And I'm happy to share this slideshow with anyone who's interested. But in terms of what's next, there's plenty more stories to be told, and I'm hoping to do a podcast. And since it's International Archives Day, I do want to say, let's save the National Archives. They're in trouble. History is being lost as we speak. I'd love for the NFSA to get more money because they are such an incredible resource for preserving the films that have been made in Australia. They're preserving our history. There's just so much treasure in there. I'd love, as an outcome of the film being made, I'd love to see a plaque put up at 67 Glebe Point Road, which is the original Sydney Women's Liberation House, and also 12 Bremer Street in Canberra and in other cities around Australia. They're important historical sites, and I think that they should be acknowledged. So I'll end there. Sorry for going over time.
That's okay, Catherine. That was fantastic. So fascinating. The ASIO stuff is genuinely creepy, right? It's amazing. Yeah. And, you know, hopefully we will have an opportunity to show more of your talk, more of your slideshow. We'll see what we can do.
Yes, I apologize for going over time.
No worries. I just want to also remind people, if you've got questions for Catherine or Adrien, put them in the Q&A and I'll read them out at the end of Adrien's talk. But now we'll hand over to Adrien. I'll quickly introduce you. So Adrien is a PhD student and sessional tutor at the Australian Catholic University, interested in gender studies and Australian criminal history. He's currently working on his thesis on transgender Australians and their interactions with the criminal justice system in 20th century Australia. Cool. Thank you, Adrien.
Thank you so much, Natasha, and thank you for having me. I'll just quickly get my screen sharing. There we go. Is that all working? Alrighty. So yeah, I'll just get started. So yeah, as we just said, my name is Adrien McCrory and my pronouns are he, him. So I'd also like to just start off by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm speaking today. And I'd like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and that sovereignty of this land was never ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So yeah, as just said, I'm a PhD student at the Australian Catholic University. I have a background in Australian history with a focus on gender and crime in the 20th century. I'm a transgender man, and the project which I am currently working on looks at the experiences of trans and gender diverse people in Australia's criminal justice system from the turn of the 20th century to the present day, although today I'll be focusing primarily on the first few decades of the 20th century. So I want to start by talking just a little bit about why I study this, why I think it's relevant to the theme of today's talk, so empowering archives. So trans and gender diverse histories have typically been very marginalized, as have the voices and stories of people moving through the criminal justice system. For trans people, a major challenge that we face simply existing in the world is finding representations of people like us that we can see ourselves in. Even today, complex representations of trans and gender diverse people are still rare in our media, our news, TV, books, movies. But when we look to the past in particular, often we don't see ourselves at all. Trans and gender diversity in history has sort of been repeatedly erased, repressed, turned invisible. And often when we can't see ourselves in history, it makes it hard for us to see ourselves in the present as well. Trans and gender diverse people often grow up pretty isolated from our histories and from our past as a group. And carving out these histories gives us all an opportunity to see that trans and gender diverse people have always been here. Trans and gender diverse people face ongoing challenges in the justice system in the present day, and in prisons and in their interactions with police. And through archival research, we can see how these challenges have their legacies in Australia's past. So I'm just going to start with some notes on language. So one thing that's important to note about the language that I'm using today is that it is sort of in the grand scheme of things relatively new and constantly changing. So some terms which were widely used only a few decades ago might now be considered offensive or at least no longer accurate. I'll mostly be talking today, as I sort of said, about the 1900s through to the 1930s. And broadly speaking, the language used then to discuss what we might now call sort of trans and gender diverse experiences tends to bear little resemblance to the language that we would use today. So I'll be using contemporary terminology today for the most part. However, when looking at history, it's never really possible to apply this language one-to-one onto people who existed before they had these words to identify with. So when I say transgender or trans or gender diverse, I'm referring to any person whose gender is different from the one that they were assigned at birth. So these are umbrella terms capturing anyone of a trans and gender diverse experience, whether they're transgender women, men, non-binary people, agender, genderqueer, gender fluid, so forth. When I say assumed male or assumed female at birth, or sort of female assumed, male assumed, what I'm referring to is the sex category a person was designated when they were born, usually based on the appearance of their sex characteristics. And when I discuss gender presentation, what I mean is simply the gendered expression that one presents to the world. So through clothing, mannerisms, language, hair, makeup, etc. And one further thing to keep in mind, when looking at history and archival sources around trans history, it's often full of language or descriptions of gender and sexual diversity, which might be offensive or otherwise upsetting to some people. I've tried to keep these kinds of descriptions to a minimum in this talk, but do be advised that there will be some content which deals with historical transphobia and homophobia if you think this might be upsetting to you personally. So if trans and gender diverse people in the past didn't have this language to describe themselves, what am I looking for in archives when I'm searching for trans histories? Can we even identify trans people in the past? What did it mean to be trans before the language evolved to describe this experience? Was there even such a thing? There's no even easy answer to any of these questions. Transgender people, so people whose genders differed from that assigned to them at birth, have always existed around the world and throughout history in a range of forms and a range of contexts. But to take, say, a single gender non-conforming person and identify them as transgender without having access to their own self-descriptions and self-identity is impossible. So how do we decide who might or might not have been trans for the purpose of research? So for the purposes of my work, I essentially say that we can't. And instead, what I'm looking for is examples of people presenting in gender non-conforming ways. And I'm thinking about how their experiences with the justice system were shaped by this gender nonconformity. So this can't tell us much about an individual person's experience of being trans in the justice system, but it can tell us a lot about how the justice system responded to gender diversity and what this would have meant for trans and gender diverse people moving through it. And we can still find interesting and insightful cases of people presenting as gender non-conforming moving through these systems and sort of without making definitive assumptions about their gender identity, we can look to their stories to see glimpses of our own histories as trans and gender diverse people in the present day. So I'll be using the gender neutral pronoun they or they, them to refer to the people that I discuss in this talk, except when I'm quoting directly from archival sources, an acknowledgement of the reality that I don't really know enough about them to assign any other pronoun to them with any certainty. So what I'm going to do for the rest of this talk is I'm going to look at some examples of gender non-conforming presentation in the first few decades of the 20th century that I've sourced from archival sources in Victoria, so mainly through the Public Records Office and through Trove and the State Library, and how these people's gender non-conformity shaped their interactions with the justice system. I'll also be talking about the kinds of records that these individuals left in the archives and what they can tell us about the processes of identifying trans and gender diverse histories in the records of the justice system. It's worth noting that the records kept by the criminal justice system in particular are recorded from positions of power and authority over those being written about, and it's very unlikely to find that they meaningfully engage with an individual's motivations, personal history, especially for expression and behaviour which challenges gender norms and expectations. So as someone trying to look at these cases through a quite human lens, this can be a big hurdle. And the best that we can do is sort of speculate and recognise that our own readings on these situations are always going to be fundamentally incomplete and biased without being able to see someone's own interior thoughts and perspectives. So the first person that I'm going to talk about today is Alice May Bunting. So Bunting was arrested in June 1905 on a charge of vagrancy while dressed in male clothing. Vagrancy was the most common charge used to arrest female assumed people dressing as male during this period. However, there was no law specifically against wearing clothes designed for another gender in Victoria. One interesting trend with these cases, which were often labelled female masqueraders in the press, was that younger female assumed people presenting as male, if they came from a respectable family background, could be treated quite leniently by the courts and by the press, with their sort of quote unquote masquerades being framed as something of a youthful adventure. For context, at the turn of the 20th century, female masqueraders made up most press reports for arrests for public gender non-conforming behaviour in Victoria. And there were two main archetypes associated with gender non-conforming female assumed people in this period. So there was a narrative sort of type of woman who disguised herself as a man to seek work or adventure, who was represented mostly in fairly positive terms and sometimes celebrated. However, the other archetype was that of the vagrant, so an unproductive and immoral figure who did not conform to social expectations of their gender. And the archetype that a person would be associated with depended on their social standing, behaviour and age. So I have an image up on the screen now of Marion Bill Edwards, who was a really good example of this kind of masquerader or girl in male attire, as they were sometimes called. So Edwards was a female assumed person who spent most of their adult life presenting as male and who reached public prominence in two court cases in 1906 and 1916. And Edwards was something of a favourite character of the Australian press for a while, who presented them as savvy and attractive. And after their case, it wasn't unusual to see Edwards' name referred to in other reports of gender nonconformity, fitting them into a similar lineage. However, Bunting's apparent cycle with poverty and crime marked them instead more as this vagrant type of masquerader. And despite their youth, so they were 18 when they were arrested, the reports about their case didn't frame them with that same intrigue or adventurous spirit as they did with cases like Edwards. Instead, the press described Bunting as covered with dirt, framed them as poor and not respectable. Bunting had previously been charged with larceny in 1904 and was fined £20 and sent to prison for 2 months when they couldn't pay. Sexual impropriety may have also factored into how they were treated. So Bunting was pregnant when arrested and was later sent to the lying-in hospital of the Ballarat Benevolent Asylum. So someone like Bunting, who was unmarried, pregnant, seemingly stuck in a cycle of criminal behaviour and poverty, might sort of serve as an example of the kinds of social issues which were relevant in the early 20th century about sort of moral corruption, which were seen to potentially take place if young women were removed from the domestic sphere. And the gender nonconformity that someone like Bunting expressed by dressing in male clothing only served to sort of reinforce these anxieties. So Bunting was charged again the following year with larceny, although with no further mention of any gender nonconforming presentation, but apparently still caught in this cycle of vagrant offences. So Bunting's case left only a very small mark in the archives, so a few lines in a few petty sessions registers, which when taken together shows someone who is struggling with poverty and moving in and out of the criminal justice system. And I start with them here to sort of demonstrate a common type of story that can be found looking for gender nonconformity in the archives. So many cases resemble Bunting's, especially for female assumed people presenting as male who were struggling with poverty. And in some cases of this type, we can speculate that maybe the gender nonconforming presentation was an attempt to avoid attention or find work or move with relative safety through public spaces alone. On sort of the flip side, other cases suggest a more dedicated engagement with gender nonconformance and or sort of queer expression. So the next person that I want to talk about was named Roy Bellamy, but was also known as Minnie Mackenzie. And Mackenzie is the name that I will use to refer to them throughout this talk. So Mackenzie was arrested for masquerading in women's clothing on Flemington Road in 1937. They received a 6-month prison sentence for the act. And this relatively harsh sentence reflected how the police and the courts saw them, as sexually deviant and disreputable. So prior to this incident, Mackenzie was already known to the police, who considered them a sort of, quote, reputed thief who associated with other thieves and, quote, men who masqueraded as women. The two groups lumped together in the newspaper reporting. So police arrested Mackenzie, who was aged in their 50s, wearing a black skirt and black shoes, an old fur coat, white stockings, and the press emphasised that they were partly bald and going by the name Minnie Mackenzie. So the police arrested Mackenzie and charged them again with vagrancy. The constable who arrested Mackenzie saw them talk to 2 men on Flemington Road, and 1 man accompanied them in the direction of the gardens. So gardens such as these often served as beats, so semi-public spaces where men could meet anonymously for sexual encounters, and they were closely monitored by police. So the constable also stated that they had previously warned Mackenzie about going out dressed in women's clothing. And when Mackenzie went to court, they went on the witness stand in their female attire, even though they had earlier asked the police to find them other clothes to wear. So the police insisted that Mackenzie go to court dressed as they were. And these compounding factors, so the police insistence that they wear the feminine clothing to court, their prior reputation as a thief who associated with other masqueraders, and the queer association of them accompanying a man to the gardens, all shaped Mackenzie's experience and how they were sentenced. So their financial situation was also another factor, as they could not produce the money on hand necessary to show that they had sufficient means of support and negate their vagrancy charge. As with Alice Bunting, Mackenzie's encounters with the justice system now exist as short records in the archives and small newspaper reports. The most newsworthy thing about them was in both cases, the masquerade, which is the reason that it's now possible to return to the archives at all and identify them out of the thousands of other petty sessions cases. Sorry. So while there might be small incidents in and of themselves, taken alongside the numerous cases like them, they begin to paint a picture of the ways that gender nonconformity attracted police attention throughout this period, despite gender nonconforming dress and expression not being illegal. So the last person that I want to look at now in the time that I have left is the case of Albert John Weston. So unlike Bunting and Mackenzie, Weston's case was heard in the Supreme Court and left a much more detailed record behind in the archives. So in 1919, Weston was taken to trial for shooting a police constable while fleeing from arrest. At the time of the shooting, Weston was wearing female clothing. In many ways, Weston's presentation was incidental to the case. So they did not give a reason for the dress in the defense. And in reports of the arrest and trial, it was often noted in the reporting independently of the rest of the account without much commentary. But newspapers and the press still love this element, often noting the masquerade in headlines to capture attention, although it rarely came up much in the actual body of the reports. In Weston's trial, it seems to have factored into questions about their mental capacity and culpability, but otherwise remained peripheral to the case itself. During the trial, the counsel for Weston's defence made a formal request in December 1919 for Weston to be medically examined by the government medical officer before they pleaded in trial. In Weston's own testimony, they claimed to have been suffering from headaches and said that they did not have any recollection of the hours leading up to the shooting. Their wife stated that Weston had been suffering from insomnia and had been behaving unusually during the day, appearing vague and vacant. But Weston's gender nonconformity also factored into the wife's testimony, with her stating that Weston had left the house after she had tried to stop them, and she followed them to Chapel Street in South Yarra, but that they were still dressed in male clothing at the time, and it was ambiguous when and where they had acquired and dressed in female clothing. The report, which was returned from the medical officer, said that in spite of the testimony, Weston showed no evidence of unsoundness of mind. The way that Weston's wife conflated the insomnia and the strange behaviour with the mysterious acquisition of the female attire indicated that the court also likely considered, conflated these elements. Various theories of sexual inversion as sort of psychological abnormality were floating in the public discourse in the early decades of the 20th century, popularised by international psychologists and sexologists such as Richard von Krafft-Ebing, Havelock Ellis, Freud, although they weren't hugely prominent in Australia until later in the 1920s. So these schools of thought conflated gender nonconformity and homosexuality with mental degeneracy in the growing medical discourse. And although there were other aspects to this case that sort of called Weston's mental state into question, it's still likely that the gender nonconforming behaviour also factored into this line of inquiry, in line with these beliefs that gender nonconformity was in some way pathological. Within the trial itself, the witness's language is really interesting to read back over from a modern perspective. Several times the witnesses described Weston as a woman in their run from the police, including feminine pronouns and descriptors. So the woman came out, I asked her for the money, or I overtook her and pulled her down on her back, some quotes from the witness statements. The pronouns and language then seemed to shift following sort of the reveal of Weston's quote sort of unquote disguise to masculine pronouns instead. And in one section of the deposition, the court records begins with a witness statement using the masculine pronoun, and the record has been manually crossed out and replaced with she as the feminine pronoun, which is you can kind of see on the screen there. The gender nonconforming aspect of Weston's trial occupied an interesting position in the proceedings of the case. So it was evidently not the reason for the arrest, as it was in other cases, such as Bunting's or Mackenzie's, but it was significant to the framing of the reporting. And it also factored into questions about Weston's mental capacity to stand trial, which connected to ideas about gender nonconforming presentation being considered evidence of mental abnormality. Finally, the way that it was discussed and presented in the courtroom demonstrated a negotiation of how gender and gendered presentation was being understood. So why are these stories empowering? So as I noted earlier, court records are recorded from a position of power, and we're unlikely as researchers to find unmediated testimony from criminals in their interactions with the justice system, and we're extremely unlikely to find unmediated perspectives from trans or gender diverse people at this time. Even in cases where gender non-conforming people do leave behind first-hand accounts of their lives, those are themselves written with their social context, within their social context, and constrained by the language, ideas, social norms, and expectations around them, which fundamentally shape the narrative and make it challenging to line them up with present-day ideas of sex, gender, sexuality, and expression. But even with all these challenges, representations of marginalised perspectives are necessary as both a means for giving trans and gender diverse people in the present day ways to see themselves represented in the past, and as a way to understand the legacies of trans criminal justice experiences and how they impact present day realities and vulnerabilities. So just to finish off, I just want to emphasize why this kind of historical research is important. And I want to spend a few moments highlighting some challenges facing trans and gender diverse and LGBT people broadly in the present day when it comes to engaging with the criminal justice system. So surveys such as the Enough is Enough report back in 2000 and the more recent Private Lives and Writing Themselves In reports published last year and this year have consistently shown that LGBT people and transgender people especially are more likely to have had contact, and specifically negative contact, with police, and are less likely to report abuse, intimate partner violence or harassment to the police out of a fear that they won't support them. Transgender people also face a range of challenges in Australian prisons and are more likely to experience assault and self-harm while incarcerated, and guidelines for placing transgender prisoners in female or male prisons are inconsistent and haphazardly applied throughout the country. And just understanding where we've come from and how it shapes the present, what has changed and what changes we still need to make is essential for trans and gender diverse people in the present day to understand our histories and our present day realities. So archival histories of trans and gender diversity tell us how gender nonconformity was policed in the past, but they can also provide insight into the ongoing policing of trans and gender diversity today. And that's kind of everything from me. I will stop sharing. I'll pass back to you, Natasha.
Great, thank you, Adrien. That was your research is so interesting and also really, really important. So it's fantastic that you're doing what you're doing and finding those stories in the archives, which, I mean, I'm not sure whether other people have found them before. So it's great sort of looking at them from a different perspective and, you know, finding out those stories.
Some people have done some really good work looking at them. Lucy Chesser is a big
cool.
of someone
who's fantastic
about a fair bit of this stuff. Yep.
Cool. We have got a couple of minutes, so very quickly, we've got a few questions here. So Catherine, Melina Smith has asked, in lieu of recent news where Senator James Patterson is monitoring tweets by ABC journalists, what impact does feminism still have today when women are still being targeted by conservative groups, and how can we evolve as a society?
Thank you for the question. I wasn't aware of that, so I was thinking today, given how much surveillance was done on people in left-wing movements in the time that I was looking at, and we know, of course, it was going on well before the 70s, since, you know, it's a Cold War thing. It's interesting to compare how we might be being surveilled today, and it's certainly a lot easier in a way because many of us are sharing so much of ourselves on social media. So it is interesting and something that's worth looking at. I'm not sure if anyone is looking at it. I don't know what ASIO is doing these days, but Barbara Creed, another woman in the film, is very active in animal liberation, and I think ASIO is definitely watching. That's one of the organisations that's sort of being watched as a potential terrorist threat. So they're definitely still doing stuff. In terms of, I mean, it is funny that really the only subversive thing that women were doing in the women's liberation movement was talking to each other and sharing their stories. they certainly weren't going to do anything, well, I was going to say dangerous, but I suppose talking is dangerous because they were subverting the sort of nuclear family patriarchal structure of society, and that is dangerous to the powers that be. So that's why it's still threatening. And as far as we've come, we still have a long way to go, and it's very hard to challenge institutional power. I think, you know, just by listening to Adrien's story there, that shifting the way institutions treat people is very difficult. So anyway, I digress.
Oh, cool. We've got probably time for like one more question. So Pan asks a question for Adrien. Are you also looking at records of transgender people in the archives who has contact with asylums? My understanding is quite a few records are held about trans people who were also policed and institutionalized as a result of their contact with authorities.
Yeah, and this is a great question, and it's something that I want to get a bit more into. I've definitely found a few sort of cases where people have moved into, gone through the justice system and have been referred on to asylums or other sort of mental health sort of institutions. I haven't sort of dug deep into those actual records myself yet, but I do want to get my hands on them because there is a lot of this thing of pathologizing, I guess, of gender diversity, and sort of we see over time a shift towards sort of seeing it as a sort of mental condition or something like that, where it does begin to be policed both, you know, in terms of the criminal justice system, and then sort of the two systems, the criminal justice system and the health system, sort of working together to sort of police gender nonconformity in different ways, I suppose. But yeah, it's something that I want to get more into.
It would make a really interesting documentary, I think.
It would.
Awesome. It is 3:01, so we don't have time for any more questions, but if people do want to send the questions to me, my email, you would have seen my email address in your invite. So if you want a copy of the slideshows or got any further questions, send everything to me. I'll filter through and get to the right people. But thank you so much everyone for watching, and thank you Adrien and Catherine. That was absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure people really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yes, thank you for having us.
Thanks. See you everyone.